sometimes I close my eyes and I can still see it. The raw, untamed gleam of creation itself, a whisper from the cosmic cradle. They called it stardust, a romantic name for the cold, hard promise that drifted in the inky black. We left Earth, a planet hollowed out and gasping, chasing that promise. We told ourselves we were pioneers, forging a new destiny, bringing salvation back home. But the void doesn't care for dreams. It doesn't care for ownership, only for power. And soon, the whispers of liberation turned into the harsh, metallic clang of chains, forged not from stardust, but from the very human greed that followed us beyond the sky. Who owned the stars? We soon learned, to our sorrow, that the answer was always the same: not us. Sometimes the silence is so profound here, in the cold, distant expanse, that my mind wanders back to a different kind of quiet. Not the sterile hush of an orbital habitat, but the muffled stillness of a world slowly suffocating. Earth. I can still taste the air, thick with the recycled ghosts of a million breaths, carrying the faint, metallic tang of desperation that had become our daily bread. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm that brought her to her knees, but a long, slow bleak, a quiet erosion of everything vibrant, everything bountiful. We spoke of the great depletion in hushed tones, as if naming it too loudly might hasten its grim work. But it was already upon us. The rich veins of the earth, once so generous, had been plundered, not by a single greedy hand, but by generations of collective hunger. The rare earths, the precious metals, the very building blocks of our advanced world, they dwindled to critical levels. The screens flickered, the grids groaned, and the elaborate machinery of our lives began to seize, one slow, grinding halt after another. It wasn't just the raw materials, it was the ripple effect. Farmlands, poisoned by decades of industrial runoff, yielded only stunted crops, genetically engineered to survive, but devoid of the robust life force we once took for granted. Oceans, once teeming, were silent, their coral gardens bleached skeletons, their depths choked with our waste. Even the sky, once a canvas of limitless blue, was often a hazy, dull gray, a permanent testament to our consumption. Life became a delicate negotiation with scarcity. Every resource, from the purest water to the simplest alloy, was meticulously catalogued, rationed, fought over, not with grand battles, but with the quiet, gnawing anxiety that permeated every transaction, every glance. The great cities, once symbols of humanity's soaring ambition, became towering tombs of recycled steel and composite, their populations confined, regulated, monitored. The vibrant street markets I saw in ancient historical archives, bursting with fresh produce and chatter, had given way to sterile distribution centers, where rations were dispensed with the precision of a ticking clock. Hope, a currency more precious than any rare earth, began to deflate, leaving behind a brittle, pragmatic resignation. We were a people living on borrowed time, on borrowed air, beneath a borrowed sky. The existential crisis wasn't a theoretical threat whispered in academic circles. It was the pervasive scent of ozone and recycled plastic, the dull ache in the chest from perpetually compromised air, the hollow gnawing of a future that seemed to have no horizon. Humanity, for all its ingenuity, found itself trapped on a dying sphere, its resources irrevocably spent, its spirit quietly flickering. The grand narratives of progress and endless expansion had crumbled, leaving behind the stark reality of limits. We had gorged ourselves, and now the feast was over, leaving only the bitter taste of ashes. It was in this desperate, suffocating quiet that our gaze, almost instinctively, began to lift upwards, beyond the hazy gray ceiling of our self-made prison. There, in the terrifying, beautiful emptiness, lay the answer, or so we told ourselves. The cosmos, vast and indifferent, held untold riches, pristine and untouched. A new Eden, shimmering in the cold, dark void. It was a dream born of desperation, a last trembling gasp for air. The SkyClaim program was born from that collective, frantic hope. It wasn't merely an initiative. It was a desperate plea for salvation, a promise whispered across a dying world. The global conglomerates, the ones who had profited most from Earth's rapid consumption, were the first to champion it, their vast resources pivoting with astonishing speed from terrestrial exploitation to extraterrestrial ambition. They painted vivid pictures of gleaming orbital factories, of endless supplies of minerals, of a revitalized Earth, its wounds healed by the cosmic bounty. Propaganda flickered on every screen, echoing through every recycled air apartment, depicting brave pioneers venturing into the black, not as invaders, but as saviors. The initial ships were crude, barely more than glorified cargo haulers fitted with advanced drills and processing units, a testament to how far our terrestrial engineering had fallen. They were designed to reach the nearest asteroid belts, those shimmering necklaces of rock and metal that had once been distant curiosities. Now, they were our future, our only hope. The training programs were grueling, the risks unimaginable, but the queues of volunteers stretched for kilometers. Farmers whose land had turned to dust, miners whose veins had run dry, engineers who yearned for a purpose beyond mere maintenance. They all flocked to the banners of SkyClaim. Their faces it twitched with a desperate, fragile hope. I remember standing in the sterile viewing galleries, watching the first launches. The roar of the engines, muffled by layers of recycled glass, felt less like a celebration and more like a collective sigh, a whisper of possibility, carried on a pillar of fire, tearing through the suffocating atmosphere. We weren't just sending rockets. We were sending our last prayers, our final desperate gamble. We believed then that the stars held only opportunity, a clean slate, a chance to rebuild. We believed that the void, unlike our ravaged home, would be impartial, offering its bounty to all who dared to reach. We were so naive, so profoundly, desperately hopeful. We forgot that the greed that had hollowed out our home was not bound by gravity, but by the very human heart. And the stars, indifferent as they were, would offer no sanctuary from ourselves. Sometimes, the past doesn't feel like memory at all, but a waking dream, lucid and persistent. It drifts back, unbidden, like fine dust motes caught in a sunbeam, revealing a landscape long since eroded, a truth long since buried. I remember the broadcasts, the way they painted the cosmos in hues of impossible wonder, a canvas for heroes. They flickered across every grimy screen, whispered from every cracked speaker, weaving a spell over a world starved for magic. The first wave, they called them. The prospectors. Not just miners, never just miners. They were the star scouts, the void tenders, the harvesters of the hollow dark. Their faces, scrubbed clean and beaming, were splashed across every available surface. The peeling plaza walls of the city, the dim-lit alleys where children played amongst discarded bio-waste, Even the tattered hollow projections above the designated water queues. They were clad in gleaming suits, not the utilitarian gray of engineers, but suits of burnished silver and deep azure, designed to catch the light, to reflect a future blindingly bright. Beyond the veil, the deep, resonant voice of the network anchor would declare, a voice that rarely spoke of the failing crop yields or the dwindling energy reserves. Our pioneers forge a new destiny. They bring salvation from the stars. And the images that followed, oh, those images, pristine, untouched asteroids tumbling through the velvet black, shot with streaks of brilliant gold, shimmering veins of blue, and the raw, unpolished gleam of what they promised was pure, unadulterated resource, platinum for our failing grids, rare earths for our dying soils, water clean and abundant, locked in ancient ice. It was a siren song, a lullaby for a dying planet, sung by the very people who had watched it wither. They showed not the grinding labor, not the crushing loneliness, not the terrifying silence of the void. They showed discovery. They showed abundance. They showed hope, carefully curated and meticulously broadcast. On Earth, hope was a luxury, one Alara's family could scarcely afford. I remember her, a wisp of a girl, too thin, too pale, her eyes enormous in a face perpetually smudged with the dust that seemed to coat everything. Her home was a cramped, air-filtered apartment unit, one among thousands stacked precariously in a former factory district. The air purifiers hummed a constant weary tune, a reminder of the toxic breath of the outside world. Food was rationed, water carefully measured. Every day was a calculation, a slow subtraction of dwindling resources, a desperate clinging to existence. Alara would sit by the sputtering hollow projector, her knees drawn up to her chest, her small frame dwarfed by the flickering giants on the screen. Her father, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the grease of a defunct machinery plant, would sigh and shake his head, muttering about fool's gold and empty promises. Her mother, whose cough grew heavier with each passing season, would gaze at the images with a wistful longing, a faint, fleeting smile gracing her lips. But Alara believed. She believed in the glint of the stardust, in the promise of the boundless deep. The images weren't just propaganda to her. They were visions of deliverance. She saw the glittering metals, not as mere elements, but as solution. Platinum meant power for the struggling city, fewer blackouts. Rare earths meant fertile soil, and maybe, just maybe, enough food for everyone, for her family to eat without the constant ache of hunger. The ice asteroids, the ones they called celestial springs, meant water, clean and pure, enough to drink without the gritty taste of purification tablets. She would whisper their names, names like the Dauntless, the Star Seeker, the Void Dancer, the ships that sliced through the dark. She imagined herself aboard one, her small hand pressed against a viewport, watching Earth shrink into a blue marble, leaving behind the dust and the hunger. In her child's mind, the stars weren't distant, indifferent fires. They were reservoirs of untapped potential, patiently waiting to bestow their bounty upon a world that had forgotten how to thrive. At night, when the drone of the city's failing infrastructure lulled her to sleep, Alara's dreams were not of the dusty streets or the gray skies, but of weightlessness, of drifting through fields of unmined riches, her fingers tracing the cold, smooth surface of a meteor laden with unimaginable wealth. She dreamt of bringing it back, not for herself, but for the pale faces she saw every day, for the parched throats and the hungry bellies. She imagined the cheers, the relief, the planet breathing a collective sigh of thanks. The adults spoke of the new age of abundance, a phrase repeated endlessly on the feeds, yet it never seemed to reach their crumbling reality. But for Ilara, the words were a mantra. They spoke of infinite resources, of breaking free from planetary scarcity. The cosmos, they said, was the ultimate frontier, a grand benevolent provider, and the prospectors, those brave souls venturing into the great unknown, were not just adventurers. They were the architects of a golden age, pulling humanity back from the precipice. She longed to join them, not for glory, not for personal wealth, but for the simple, profound wish to fill the gnawing void that permeated every corner of her young life. The void of hunger, the void of fear, the void of a future that felt increasingly small and bleak. The stars, she believed, held the answers. They held salvation. And in her innocent, desperate heart, she clung to that promise, unaware that the void did not care for promises, only for what could be taken, what could be owned. The whispers of liberation, even then, were already beginning to twist into something colder, something harder, something that would eventually clang like chains. But for now, for Ilara, the stars still sang of a brighter tomorrow. I remember the silence of those first months, a profound, heavy blanket that stretched from one star to the next. It was a silence broken only by the hum of our life support, the distant thrum of a drill, and the frantic beat of our own hearts. We were adrift, tiny specks against the infinite, yet armed with a hope so fierce it felt like defiance. We chased the stardust, those cold, glittering rocks that promised to mend a broken earth, and in doing so offered us a sliver of new life. Our first successes weren't grand, not by the standards of the titans back home. They were humble victories. A steady stream of water ice from a passing comet, painstakingly purified. A small, stable deposit of iron-nickel ore within the belly of a dead asteroid, enough to fabricate a new hull section, or a stronger brace for fragile habitat. We lived in modules jury-rigged from old cargo containers, tethered together by faith and 1,000 meters of reinforced cable. They spun slowly, creating a whisper of artificial gravity, just enough to keep our bones from dissolving, our minds from fracturing in the endless float. These were our orbital outposts, born of desperation and a singular collective will. They were the very definition of fragile, yet they were ours. And then came the big one. It wasn't one event, but a series of discoveries, each more breathtaking than the last. A spectral analysis anomaly turned out to be an asteroid rich in rare Earth elements. The very elements Earth was choking on, the neural pathways of its dwindling tech. Another, a motherlode of platinum group metals, gleaming like captured moonlight in the beam of our headlamps. We'd found not just survival, but abundance. The reports we sent back, hushed and disbelieving at first, grew bolder, imbued with the euphoria of prospectors who had hit the mother lode. We pictured the faces on Earth, the gasped breaths, the renewed purpose our discoveries would bring. For a brief, intoxicating period, there was a feeling akin to prosperity. It wasn't the kind of prosperity found in opulent mansions or lavish feasts. It was simpler, more profound, The nutrient paste in our rehydrators gained a little more flavor. The recycled air felt a fraction cleaner. New tools arrived, less makeshift, more efficient. We even managed to fabricate small clear viewports, offering unimpeded panoramas of the cosmic canvas we called home. Laughter echoed louder in the cramped corridors, less forced, more genuine. We celebrated each successful haul, each new module added to our growing clusters of habitats. We were a family, forged in the crucible of the void, bound by shared hardship and the electrifying promise of a future we were building with our own hands. It was a fleeting taste, sweet and tantalizing, like a dream you tried desperately to cling to upon waking. Even then, in the glow of our nascent triumph, a cold shadow began to stretch across the vast distances. The comms, once solely a lifeline to our benefactors, the Earth-based consortiums that had funded our initial desperate exodus, began to change. Their messages grew more frequent, their tone shifting from encouragement to keen inquiry, then to thinly veiled demands. They wanted more detailed manifests, precise coordinates, projected yields, not just of what we found, but of what we could find. We called them the shadows, not because they hid, but because their presence felt like an eclipse slowly creeping over our sun-drenched hopes. Their names were whispers on distant channels. Omnicorp, Stellar Harvest, Terraform Futures. Corporations that had once seemed like benevolent patrons now revealed their true nature. The initial investment, the one that had bought our freedom from a dying world, now felt less like a gift and more like a leash. The very infrastructure we relied upon, the transport ships, the advanced processors, the heavier drills, were all ultimately controlled by them. Their support came with an increasingly steep price, a tightening web of contracts and clauses that began to feel less like partnership and more like ownership. We started to see it in the little things. Our supply drops, once meticulously tailored to our needs, began to include items we hadn't requested, items that felt more like monitoring equipment. The telemetry data we transmitted, once for operational efficiency, became a tool for their constant oversight. New protocols, ostensibly for safety, placed more restrictions on our independent movements, on where we could prospect and how much we could retain for our own maintenance and expansion. The whispers of liberation that had fueled our journey began to be drowned out by the metallic clang of chains, forged not from stardust, but from the very human greed that had followed us beyond the sky. I remember watching the endless ballet of stars outside my viewport, their cold fire mocking my dwindling hope. Who owned the stars? We had been so naive, so certain that out here, in the infinite void, we could escape the old Earth diseases. But the disease of ownership, of power concentrated in the hands of a few, had merely mutated. It had followed us, an invisible parasite, hitchhiking on our dreams. The magnificent successes we had wrought, the fragile outposts we had painstakingly built, were no longer symbols of our triumph, but shining beacons for the predatory gaze of Earth. The warnings were subtle at first, like the phantom itch of a limb that wasn't there. A sharp drop in our independent fuel allocation, a sudden delay in a critical part shipment. Then, the direct messages: your current yield projections are insufficient. We expect a 15% increase next cycle. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and it carried the unspoken weight of what would happen if we failed to comply. Our fleeting prosperity had merely ripened the fruit for plucking. We had built their new empire for them, unknowingly, with our own sweat and blood. The void didn't care for dreams or for ownership. But the corporations did, and soon, we knew, the quiet hum of our habitat would be replaced by the harsh metallic clang of their true intentions. The conflict, though yet unfought, was already brewing in the silent, predatory hum of the distant comms, a promise of subjugation that would eclipse even the brightest stardust. I remember the day the news broke, though broke feels too sharp, too sudden for how it truly arrived. It was more like a slow, shimmering ripple across a vast, still lake. The kind that begins almost imperceptibly, then grows, catching the light in 1,000 unexpected ways until the entire surface is transformed. They called it P-71, a sterile bureaucratic name for something that pulsed with the promise of life itself. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, I can still see the holographic projections that followed its discovery. Swirling nebulae of unimaginable mineral wealth, veins of platinum and iridium running through its core like luminous rivers, rare earth elements concentrated to a density never before imagined. It was an anomaly, a cosmic lottery win, an entire world's worth of what we desperately needed, just floating there, indifferent and magnificent. P-71 wasn't just rich, it was obscene. It was the kind of treasure that made ancient kings and mythical dragons blush. On Earth, a planet that had been bled dry, where the sky wept acid rain, and the soil remembered only the ghosts of harvests past, P-71 was more than just a discovery. It was salvation. The very word tasted like rain on parched lips. It whispered of clean air, of fertile ground, of cities rebuilt from the dust. It promised to quench the thirst of a dying world, to mend the gaping wounds of resource depletion and environmental collapse. The desperate, hopeful belief that space was our ultimate answer, our final chance, solidified around P-71 like ice around a core. We'd left Earth chasing a dream, and suddenly, that dream felt tangible. Within reach, we saw a future where humanity could breathe again. A future forged from the cold, hard gleam of stardust. And then, the scramble began. Not a gentle unfolding, but a frantic, uncoordinated surge, like a flock of birds startled by a sudden sound. Every nation, every megacorporation, every consortium that had even a whisper of a space program, turned its hungry gaze towards P-71. The quiet scientific observation posts became bustling command centers. The slow, methodical pace of cosmic exploration gave way to a feverish acceleration. Designs for faster ships, more efficient mining drones, advanced orbital refineries, all of them, once theoretical blueprints, were pulled from archives, dusted off, and put into frantic production. The airwaves thrummed with declarations. Vague, sweeping claims were made over the discovery zone, over celestial heritage, over territorial rights that stretched billions of kilometers into the void. The International Space Treaty, once a delicate framework of cooperation, began to fray at the edges, stretched taut by the colossal weight of P-71's promise. Lawyers and diplomats, once focused on terrestrial squabbles, now found themselves grappling with questions of ownership in a realm where such concepts felt absurdly small. How do you draw lines in the boundless dark? How do you stake a claim on a silent, indifferent chunk of primordial matter? But humans, oh, humans found a way. The initial global jubilation, the shared sigh of relief, quickly soured. The hopeful whispers of unity, of a shared future, were drowned out by the metallic clang of competing interests. State-backed entities, financed by governments desperate to save their populations, jostled for position with the behemoth corporations, who saw in P-71 not just salvation, but unprecedented profit. Suddenly, the common goal of revitalizing Earth fractured into 1,000 self-serving ambitions. Friendships between scientific teams, painstakingly built over decades of shared cosmic awe, snapped under the pressure. Accusations of industrial espionage flew like debris in a meteor shower. Minor orbital incidents, once dismissed as technical glitches, now carried the heavy scent of sabotage. The void, once a place of quiet contemplation and shared wonder, became a chessboard for Earth's petty, grasping desires. Every nation, every corporate titan, saw P-71 as theirs. Not humanity's, but theirs. And so, the bitter scramble began. It is a Cold War of a different kind, fought not with weapons initially, but with patents, with orbital deployments, with data encryption, with the silent, relentless advance of competing probes and claims. The dream of space as a frontier of liberation, where we might shed the burdens of Earth, began to twist. It became clear that we hadn't left our greed behind on the dying planet. We had merely given it new, impossibly vast arenas in which to play. P-71, the shimmering beacon of hope, had, in a single stroke, become the catalyst for the very conflicts we had hoped to escape. The chains, it turned out, were not forged by cosmic law, but by the relentless, all-consuming need to own. And we, the pioneers, the dreamers, could only watch as the stars themselves became just another commodity to be claimed, guarded, and fought over. The afterglow of P-71's discovery, I remember, lasted only a handful of fleeting moments, like catching a glimpse of a supernova, brilliant, breathtaking, yet ultimately too far, too vast for our frail human hands to truly grasp. We had seen it, my father and I, our breath misting inside our helmets, the raw, untamed gleam of creation itself, a whisper from the cosmic cradle, so close we could almost taste the ancient metallic tang. We called it stardust, a romantic name for the cold, hard promise that drifted in the inky black. For a brief, intoxicating period, P-71 was ours. Our beacon, our salvation, the answer to the hollowed-out Earth we'd left behind. It was the dream, untarnished. Then the static started. Not in our comms, not in the void itself, but in the fragile ecosystem of independent prospectors that had dared to believe in a new beginning. The news of P-71, a rogue asteroid of unimaginable metallic wealth, had spread like wildfire across the interplanetary nets, igniting not joy, but a wildfire of greed. The whispers of liberation, of carving our own destiny beyond Earth's gravity, turned with a sickening swiftness into the harsh metallic clang of chains. Chains forged not from stardust, but from the very human avarice that had followed us like a shadow beyond the sky. The Earth consortiums arrived not in battle-scarred cruisers, but in sleek, silent legal frigates, their sails unfurled with reams of parchment and obscure statutes. They were names whispered in hushed, fearful tones on every independent mining outpost. Omnicorp, Stellar Path, Horizon Ventures, faceless, monolithic entities whose tentacles reached from the core of a gasping Earth out into the farthest reaches of the Kuiper Belt. They didn't bother with direct confrontation. Why would they? When the law, or rather, the deliberate absence of clear law in the void, was their most potent weapon. Space is a vacuum, My mother had once mused, watching the stars from our small, cramped habitation module. But the law abhors a vacuum even more. She was a quiet woman with eyes that saw too much, and too often, the ugly truth behind the beautiful lie. She knew then, perhaps, what we were too naive to accept. The legal battle for P-71 wasn't fought with blasters or drone fleets, but in virtual courtrooms presided over by avatars of indifferent judges, interpreting documents that predated our grandparents. The core of the conflict was always the same: who owns the metals in space? The Outer Space Treaty of '67, a relic of a bygone era, declared space the province of all mankind, prohibiting national appropriation. But it said nothing explicitly about corporate appropriation. Nothing about the raw, untouched bounty of an unaligned asteroid. Our claims were simple, almost childlike in their earnestness. We, the independent prospectors, had found it. We had charted it. We had risked our lives, our meager savings, our very breath in the void to reach it. Our claim beacons, little more than digital flags planted in the orbital dust, hummed with the silent assertion of discovery. Ilara's family, the Chengs, the O'Malleys, we were a ragtag fleet of dreamers, bound by shared hardship and a defiant hope. But the consortiums laughed, softly, with the cold, measured mirth of those who held all the cards. Their lawyers, sharp-suited digital constructs with impossibly polished data screens for faces, presented documents hundreds of pages thick. They cited obscure terrestrial maritime laws, repurposed intellectual property rights, and newly drafted international space commerce acts that seemed to materialize out of the ether. They argued that our discovery was merely an unregistered data point, that our claim beacons were insufficient, that the very concept of first come, first served was antiquated in the face of global resource management and sustainable planetary development, noble-sounding phrases that masked a ravenous hunger. They exploited every ambiguous phrase, every legal loophole. Did our claim beacons transmit sufficiently powerful signals to be considered a permanent installation according to Article 4.7b of the newly proposed Lunar and Asteroid Resource Governance Act, LARGA? No? Then our claim was tentative, speculative, easily overridden. Had we paid the quarterly Interstellar Resource Registration Fee, IRF, to a newly formed, consortium-backed governing body? No? Then our claim was invalid, unverified. The aggressive takeovers began subtly, then escalated. First, they offered partnership agreements, contracts so convoluted they might as well have been written in an alien tongue, designed to strip away our autonomy while leaving us with the illusion of collaboration. Many independents, exhausted by the legal grind and facing mounting costs, signed. They quickly found themselves mere employees, their dreams subsumed into a corporate hierarchy, their names forgotten in the annals of a soulless ledger. Then came the outright buyouts, offers that seemed generous on paper, but only until you looked at the fine print, the non-compete clauses that banned you from space for decades, the intellectual property grabs that claimed everything you'd ever conceived. My father, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical toil, would sit for hours staring at the endless stream of legalese on his datapad, his hand hovering over the accept button, his dream of an independent future dissolving before his eyes. The alternative was worse. Ruinous lawsuits, fines that would bankrupt generations, the threat of seizure of our ships, our very means of existence. They weaponized the law, transforming it into a suffocating net. They didn't care for the spirit of exploration, the grit of the pioneer. They only cared for power. And soon the independent prospectors like us, the dreamers who had dared to chase stardust, found ourselves systematically sidelined, our voices drowned out by the thrumming machinery of corporate acquisition. We watched, helpless, as our celestial prize, P-71, was carved up, its future decided in earthbound boardrooms. The cosmic cradle became a corporate vault. The untamed gleam, once a promise of freedom, now reflected the cold, hard glint of ownership. And we soon learned, to our sorrow, that the answer to who owned the stars was always the same. Not us, not the ones who found them, not the ones who found them, not the ones who loved them. Always, and forever, the ones with the power to take. The light still clung to Alara's eyes, even then, a ghost of the blue-green world she had left behind. She remembered a childhood spent beneath synthetic suns, their warmth a poor imitation of Earth's embrace, yet all she had ever known. We were the generation born under the shadow of the great exodus, steeped in tales of depleted oceans and choked skies, fed a narrative of cosmic salvation. But salvation, like stardust, proved to be an elusive, dangerous thing. The promise had been whispered in her ear since she was old enough to understand. A chance to contribute, to earn a future, to help repay the impossible debt her family carried. A debt born of their passage to the orbitals, their housing in the passage to the orbital. Corporate-owned habitats, their very breath. The documents had been thick, their clauses labyrinthine, etched in a glowing script that seemed to shift and shimmer the more you stared at it. They called them opportunity contracts, a cruel irony. They were not contracts of opportunity, but of forfeiture. Every miner, every technician, every life support specialist was bound to them. They were not slaves. No. The corporations were careful with their semantics. They were contractual asset managers, paid in scrip, perpetually indebted for the privilege of their employment. Healthcare, habitat fees, life support, equipment maintenance. Every necessity was itemized, deducted, and carried an interest rate that coiled around your neck like an invisible garrote. You signed away years, sometimes decades, sometimes, as many whispered in the hushed corners of the dorms, your entire remaining life. The escape clause? A debt repaid, which, with the spiraling cost adjustments and the intentionally impossible quotas, rarely, if ever, materialized. Alara was older now, the youthful hope worn thin by the persistent friction of reality. Her mother's cough had grown worse, a persistent, rattling echo of the recycled air she breathed in their habitat sector. The medical bills, tallied in units of future labor, had become insurmountable. There was only one path left. She had signed her name, her hand trembling slightly, the stylus feeling impossibly heavy, a pen dipped in her own future. The journey to the asteroid cluster, a journey into the true, inky black, was a blur of recycled air and hushed goodbyes. Her crewmates were a mix of ages, faces etched with a common weariness. There was Jax, a man whose laughter seemed to have atrophied, replaced by a permanent grimace. Lyra, whose eyes, even behind the reinforced visors of her suit, held a distant, haunted quality, as if she were always seeing something just beyond the stars. And old Kale, his frame stooped, his hands gnarled, who had been mining rock since before Alara was born, and whose only ambition was to see his grandchildren breathe real air on a corporate-sponsored reclamation Earth colony. A dream as distant and shimmering as the starlight itself, their designation, Ophiuchus 7, was not the glittering prize of the corporate propaganda reels. It was a jagged shard of rock, ancient and indifferent, tethered to a massive, rotating habitation ring that hummed with the oppressive weight of 1,000 forced lives. The light here was perpetual, harsh and artificial, reflecting off polished metal surfaces that felt sterile and cold. There was no real day or night, only shifts measured by the relentless progression of a digital clock. Ilara's first days on Ophiuchus 7 were a symphony of jarring new sensations. The clang of heavy machinery, the hiss of atmospheric seals, the distant, muffled roar of rock grinders, a constant, low thrum that vibrated through her bones. The gravity was a low hum, just enough to keep her grounded, but a constant, subtle pull on her joints. The air, recycled 1,000 times, had a metallic tang. Her uniform, heavy and insulated, became a second skin. The mining rig itself was a labyrinth of cramped tunnels, carved deep into the asteroid's core. The ore, rich in precious metals, palladium, platinum, iridium, was often embedded deep within veins of unforgiving rock. Working in zero-G or low-G environments was a constant struggle. Tethered to the rock face, the drills thrummed violently in her hands, sending vibrations up her arms, until her shoulders ached with a dull, persistent throb. Every movement was slow, deliberate, a dance with inertia. A wrong push, a miscalculated wrench, and you could send yourself spinning into a bulkhead, or worse, into the exposed vacuum beyond a failing seal. But the true brutalization wasn't just the cold void or the unforgiving rock. It was the relentless pressure of the quotas. Each shift, a projected tonnage of raw ore was displayed on the crew's comm panels, a number that seemed to grow exponentially with every passing cycle. Efficiency. The corporate overseers droned over the comms, their voices devoid of warmth. Maximization of yield, fulfillment of contractual obligations. Failure to meet quota meant deductions. Deductions meant increased debt. Increased debt meant longer servitude. It was a self-perpetuating cycle designed to ensure no miner ever truly broke free. Ilara watched Jax, his face grim, struggling to dislodge a particularly stubborn vein, his breath rasping in his helmet. She saw Lyra staring blankly at her comm panel, the impossible numbers burning into her eyes, before she would attack the rock again with a frantic energy that verged on desperation. Kale, with his ancient, weary hands, moved with a practiced slowness, his movements economical, but his face was a mask of perpetual strain. She felt it too, the gnawing anxiety, the constant pressure behind her eyes. Every swing of the plasma pick, every rumble of the drill, was a frantic race against the clock, against the unforgiving ledger that tracked their every effort. Sleep was a restless, fitful thing, haunted by the grinding of rock and the numerical ghosts of unmet targets. Even in the shared recreation areas, the silence was heavy, punctuated by the occasional low murmur of despair or the hollow clink of synthetic rations. The void, she realized, wasn't just outside their ships and habitat. It was growing inside them, hollowing out their hopes, filling the space with the cold, hard weight of their chains. The stardust, once a symbol of liberation, was now just a heavier burden to bear. We were digging not for freedom, but for a deeper grave. Sometimes, when the station's deep thrum settles into a forgotten hum, I can almost drift back there. Not fully, never fully, because the ache is too sharp, too real, even now. But I remember the texture of the recycled air, thick with the scent of ozone and stale synthetic food, the endless cycle of the day-night shifts that bled into one indistinguishable stretch of time. We were a forgotten fleet, orbiting forgotten rocks, chasing the ghost of a dream we brought with us from a dying Earth. The mining station, a skeletal beast of girders and pressurized modules, was our world, our prison. Its vast, hungry maw, a collection of automated drills and processing units, chewed through the asteroid's stony heart, spitting out precious veins of metal. From my small, cramped bunk, nestled in a corridor that smelled perpetually of fear and rust, I'd watch the men and women, or what was left of them, shuffle past. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and the subtle marks of microgravity's insidious pull, were the maps of our collective despair. Each shift was a monotonous ballet of danger. The clang of heavy machinery, the high-pitched whine of the cutters, the sudden bone-rattling jolts as a new seam was cracked open. We wore suits that were both our saviors and our shrouds, thick layers of insulation and life support that muffled sound and touch, making every interaction feel distant, ghost-like. My job, like so many others, was mind-numbing repetitive, monitoring atmospheric scrubbers, calibrating mineral sensors, patching minor hull breaches caused by stray debris. Small tasks, crucial tasks, but devoid of meaning beyond survival. The real dangers were not the scheduled asteroid impacts, which the automated systems usually mitigated with chilling efficiency. No, the real dangers were the unpredictable shifts in gravity plating, the sudden depressurization, alarms that sent a cold spike of dread through your gut, the fatigue that could make a simple lever pull into a fatal error, and always the crushing weight of knowing that a rescue, if it ever came, would be too late. The void outside was indifferent. It swallowed light, sound, and hope with equal, silent hunger. Sometimes, through a reinforced viewport, I gaze out at it, at the endless, glittering tapestry of stars that seem to mock our tiny, frantic existence. So close, yet so impossibly far. A beauty that promised nothing and gave less. It was in the quiet moments, between the alarms and the clatter, that I began to see them. The small fissures in the monolithic despair. A miner named Kale, his face a canvas of old scars, would always leave half of his tasteless nutrient paste bar on the ledge outside the comms room for the younger, scrawnier recruits. No words exchanged, just a silent offering, picked up minutes later, as if by chance. It was a ritual I watched unfold, day after day, a tiny flicker of warmth in the coal. Another time, during a pressure leak drill, when panic rippled through a group of rookies, it was old man Silas, with his eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 forgotten stars, who calmly guided them through the emergency protocols, his voice a low, steady rumble, even as the alarms shrieked around us. He moved slowly, deliberately, a human anchor in a storm of fear. I saw them share secrets, too, whispered conversations in the dimly lit refectory, where the stale air hung heavy with recycled carbon dioxide. Not grand conspiracies, not yet, but coded messages about faulty equipment overlooked by the overseers, about shifts swapped to give someone a few extra hours of coveted sleep, about the dwindling supply of a certain medication that the station's automated medic bots refused to dispense without higher authorization. These were threads of connection, fragile but persistent, woven into the fabric of our controlled existence. A hand laid on a shoulder, a knowing nod when an overseer walked by, a shared look that said, "I see you. We are in this together." There was a woman, Anya, her fingers perpetually stained with mineral dust, who carried a small, tarnished silver locket. I once saw her open it, revealing not a picture but a tiny dried flower. She would hold it, just for a moment, her eyes distant, before snapping it shut and returning to her work. A memory, perhaps, of a life before the void, a silent act of rebellion against the station's relentless erasure of individuality. These small acts, almost invisible to the casual eye, accumulated in my own weary consciousness. They were not shouts of defiance, but whispers. Whispers of a truth that I had felt stirring within me since we first left Earth, but had dared not acknowledge. The initial promise of stardust and salvation had been a cruel illusion. We had escaped one form of consumption, only to be consumed by another. The void indeed cared nothing for dreams, and the powerful who had followed us here cared only for ownership. We had come seeking freedom, only to build our own gilded cage of refined ore. The metals we extracted, the lifeblood of a new economy, were not ours. Our bodies, our time, our very breath, they were not ours. Slowly, painstakingly, like the relentless pressure of deep space on a hull, the truth seeped into me. The small acts of solidarity, the shared pain, the muted defiance, were not just coping mechanisms. They were tiny, desperate flags, signaling a pervasive injustice that stretched from the barren rock we mined to the distant, dying blue marble we had left behind. And in that quiet, dawning realization, the gentle hum of the station began to sound less like a lullaby and more like a dirge. And for the first time, I felt not just sorrow, but a flicker of something sharper, colder, growing in the hollow space where hope used to be. The whispers had always been there, even in the brightest moments of false hope. The hollow echo of the void, the cold truth that space cares nothing for human ambition. But before he arrived, those whispers were sometimes drowned out by the clang of tools, the rough jokes shared over nutrient paste, the shared exhaustion that felt, briefly, like camaraderie. We were bound by the stars after all, in a common dream, however tarnished. Then the whispers found a voice, a metallic rasp that chilled us to the bone. His name, or rather, his designation, was Overseer Kalen. I remember the day he arrived, not with the usual thrum of a supply shuttle, but with a silence that pressed down on the station, as if the very air recyclers held their breath. He was not a miner, that much was clear. His uniform was too pristine, too sharp, a dark slate gray that seemed to absorb what little light our flickering overheads offered. His movements were precise, economical, like a machine designed for a singular purpose. His eyes, I remember them most vividly, were the color of polished obsidian, reflecting nothing, revealing less. They swept over us with an almost clinical detachment, assessing, categorizing, already weighing our worth, and finding it wanting. He didn't address us directly at first. There was no grand pronouncement, no rallying speech. Instead, the changes began subtly, like a slow poison seeping into the station's veins. Small, unobtrusive sensors appeared in every common area, every passageway, their tiny red eyes blinking silently. The grumbling in the mess hall, once a constant hum, began to dwindle. Conversations tapered off, words left unfinished as eyes darted nervously towards the new installations. Then came the security updates. Old access codes were nullified, replaced by biometric scans required for every door, every storage locker, even the communal wash units. Our personal comms, once a fragile link to a past we barely remembered, became restricted, monitored, their bandwidth throttled to a trickle. A new schedule was implemented, rigid and unforgiving, dictating work shifts, rest periods, and even approved recreation hours, with an exacting precision that stole any semblance of personal time. Even our consumption of nutrient paste was logged, a meticulous accounting of every calorie, every drop of recycled water. It was a suffocating embrace, tightening around us, squeezing the last remnants of our individuality. The atmosphere on the station became colder than the vacuum outside. The once familiar hum of the life support systems began to sound less like a lullaby and more like a constant low growl. Laughter, already a rare commodity, vanished entirely. The shared weariness that had once forged bonds now deepened into a silent, isolating dread. We moved like ghosts through the metallic corridors, our steps echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. We kept our heads down, our gazes fixed on the scuffed floor, avoiding eye contact, lest we betray some unspoken thought that Kalen's unseen eyes might detect. Trust became a luxury none of us could afford. Every glance, every sigh, felt like a potential transgression. I remember Elias. He was a quiet man, with hands scarred from 1,000 micrometeorite impacts, and a habit of humming old Earth folk songs under his breath when he thought no one was listening. He was one of the optimists, always seeing the bigger picture, the noble sacrifice we were making for those back home. A simple man, perhaps, but with a heart that still held a glimmer of what we'd left behind. One cycle, he was there, his worn, patched uniform, a familiar sight, in the mess hall. His quiet presence, a small comfort. The next, his bunk was empty. No announcement, no farewell, no trace. His tools, usually meticulously arranged, were gone from his locker. His assigned comms unit was deactivated. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. At first, there were whispers, of course, hushed questions exchanged in the dark corners of the habitat module. Had he been reassigned? Transferred? The official response, when it eventually trickled down through the channels, was terse. Discharged for non-compliance. Details confidential, but we knew. We looked at each other, at the vacant space where Elias had been, and a new kind of silence settled over us. It was the silence of understanding, of terror. We didn't need words to articulate the chilling truth. Elias had become a ghost in the machine, swallowed whole by the void, not of space, but of corporate indifference. His disappearance was not merely a loss. It was a message, etched in the sudden palpable fear that now gripped the station. Kalen had arrived, not just to enforce rules, but to erase resistance. And in that moment, as the whispers turned to silent screams within our minds, we understood the full weight of the chains we now wore. They were invisible, yes, but no less unbreakable. We were truly alone, adrift in the black, and the dreams we had brought with us had turned to ash. I remember the hum of our small rig, a lullaby against the vast silence. It was a fragile thing, that hum a testament to our stubborn belief that even out here, in the unfeeling void, we could carve out a space for ourselves. We were just one star speck among so many, each independent crew a flicker of defiance against the corporate constellations that had begun to loom larger in the inky black. We spoke of freedom then, of a wild frontier where grit and ingenuity still mattered more than the balance sheet. It felt like a dream, even then, thin and tenuous, like a breath held too long. The whispers began subtly, like static on a long-distance comm, barely audible over the usual chatter of prospecting claims and cargo manifests. Rumors of deals, of smaller outfits, simply vanishing, not in a catastrophic explosion, but with a quiet dignity, their transponders going dark, their mining rights absorbed, their crews folded into the ever-expanding machinery of Athel Inc. At first we dismissed them as the usual space lane gossip, the paranoia of isolated minds, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers at all, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very hull of our ships, a prelude to a storm. It didn't happen overnight, not in a blaze of glory or a thunder of battle. That would have been too dramatic, too honest for the calculated cruelty of it all. Instead, it was like the slow creep of ice across a viewport, beautiful in its lethal precision. Athel Inc. didn't conquer. It absorbed. It didn't destroy. It subsumed. One by one, the lifeblood of the Independence was cut. Even though supply lines for critical parts grew mysteriously sparse for those who weren't aligned. Access to the most lucrative asteroid belts became conditional, then impossible, without Athel's explicit endorsement. Their fleets, vast and unyielding, began to patrol routes that had once been open to all, their presence a silent, omnipresent threat. I remember a day, still vivid in the hazy dream of my memory, when the screens on our bridge flickered. Not a technical glitch, but something far more insidious. Our access codes for the interplanetary jump gate network, once universal, suddenly returned an error. Then our priority channels for emergency hails were downgraded, pushed to the back of an invisible queue. Communication with our allied independent guilds became riddled with static, then dropped altogether. It was a gradual tightening of the noose, an engineered isolation designed to break spirits before a single shot was ever fired. The official announcements came not as declarations of war, but as dry corporate press releases, disseminated through Athel's own now monopolized communication networks. Consolidation. Streamlining operations. Enhanced efficiency for the betterment of all humanity. The words were hollow, ringing with a metallic tang that tasted of deceit. Each press release detailed another acquisition, another absorption. Stellar Drift Mining Corp has agreed to merge their operations with Athel Inc. for mutual benefit. The Independent Prospectors Guild, the Cosmic Wanderers, has been integrated into Athel's Resource Management Division. The names, once symbols of hope and independence, became footnotes in the grand, cold ledger of a monolithic power. There was no negotiation, no real choice. It was an offer that couldn't be refused, enforced not by force of arms, but by the sheer, suffocating weight of Athel's control over everything. The independent processing facilities, starved of raw or they could no longer access, folded. The freelance transport convoys, finding their usual routes blocked, and their fuel depots, owned by Athel, either capitulated or withered into obscurity. Even the very comms arrays, the vast networks that stitched together humanity's scattered presence in the void, now bore the subtle, omnipresent watermark of Athel Inc. They owned the airwaves, the data streams, the very means by which we spoke to each other, by which we organized, by which we dreamed. The dramatic hostile takeover wasn't a singular event. It was a relentless tide, washing over the last vestiges of individual enterprise in space, leaving behind a stark uniform landscape. Athel Inc. became the sole proprietor of the stars. Every asteroid, every mineral vein, every gram of precious metal belonged to them. Every jump gate, Every transport vessel, every navigation beacon was under their command, and every whisper, every thought exchanged across the vastness was filtered through their systems, monitored by their watchful eyes. The silence that followed wasn't the natural, awe-inspiring silence of the cosmos. It was a man-made quiet, heavy and suffocating. The hum of our independent rig, once a lullaby, became a ghost, an echo of what was lost. The dream of pioneers, of forging a new destiny, died with a whimper, replaced by the harsh reality of an unchallengeable monopoly. We had chased stardust, a promise of liberation, only to find that the chains we sought to escape on Earth had followed us beyond the sky, reforged and gleaming, under the singular, cold gaze of Athel Inc. We were no longer pioneers. We were merely cogs, turning in a machine we no longer owned, mining not for freedom, but for a master whose shadow now stretched across the entire void. The question of who owned the stars had been definitively answered, and the sorrowful truth settled deep in our bones. Not us, never us. It was Kale, of course. It always felt like Kale, even before I knew. Before the comms went silent, before the low, mournful klaxon echoed through the station's hollow corridors, a sound that always meant a void had opened where a life once was. Sometimes, when the station hums its quiet lullaby, I close my eyes and I can still see him. The faint dust of asteroid grit clinging to his eyelashes, the way his hand would instinctively reach for mine, even when we were just passing in a crowded access tube. He had a laugh that was a little too loud for the hushed confines of our lives out here, a beautiful rebellion against the crushing silence of space. He was the anchor, the warm, vibrant color in the muted palette of our existence. He was my home, out among the silent, indifferent stars. The official report came, swift and sterile, delivered by a synth voice that offered its programmed condolences with chilling efficiency. Unforeseen structural fatigue, it claimed, in Sector Gamma 7 during routine extraction. A tragic, unavoidable incident. They spoke of microfractures, cosmic radiation, the inherent dangers of deep void mining. They offered a paltry credit sum, a quiet cremation, and a mandatory period of grief counseling that felt more like monitoring. But their words were like static against the memory of Kale's last message to me, a hurried whisper across the private channel. Something's off, Ilara. The stress readings are redlining, but Athel's pushing us to ignore them. Says it's calibration error. Calibration error. The phrase clung to me like space dust, heavy and suffocating. It became the mantra of my grief, a quiet, furious hum beneath the surface of my sorrow. The void doesn't care for dreams. It only cares for power, the hook had said. And Athel Inc. was the embodiment of that power, stretching its shadowy tendrils across the star charts, owning everything from the raw ore we dug to the very air we breathe. They owned even our memories, or so they tried, by whitewashing Kale's final moments into a footnote of cosmic randomness. But they didn't own my memories. I remembered the way Kale's brow would furrow when he talked about the safety protocols being bypassed, the cost-cutting measures that felt less like efficiency and more like a gamble with human lives. He saw it, felt it, whispered it to me. And now he was gone. The days after blurred into a soft-focus nightmare, the station's lights dimmer, the metallic tang in the recycled air more potent. I moved through the routines, a ghost among the living. But inside, a quiet resolve began to bloom, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. They had stolen Kale, and in doing so, they had shown me the true face of the cosmic cradle, not the romantic promise of stardust, but the brutal, indifferent greed that hollowed out planets and men alike. I had to know. I had to understand the true depth of their corruption, the cold, calculating mechanisms behind the synth voice and the sterile reports. Not for revenge, not in a blaze of glory, but for Kale, for the memory of his laugh, for the truth that deserved to be known in the face of their lies. My search began quietly, meticulously, in the dead hours between shifts when the station's hum was at its lowest. I went through Kale's personal logs, encrypted comms he thought only he could access, digging through layers of routine data, personal messages, and technical specs. It felt like sifting through the remnants of a dream, trying to piece together a reality that felt increasingly unreal. I sought out old friends of Kale's, other miners with haunted eyes and hushed voices. They spoke of incidents, of anomalies, of colleagues who vanished or reassigned to remote, forgotten outposts after asking too many questions. Fear hung heavy in the air between us, a shared understanding that Ethel Inc. had eyes and ears everywhere. Yet their subtle nods, the fleeting looks of shared sorrow, confirmed my growing suspicion. Kale's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was a symptom, then buried deep within a forgotten directory on an old salvaged data pad Kale had gifted me. I found them. Not full files, not neatly organized reports, but fragments, encrypted packets of data, barely coherent, seemingly random bursts of text and audio that defied Athel's robust firewalls. Some were old, dating back months, even a year. Others were more recent, from weeks before Kale's death. They were whispers in the dark, digital echoes of fear and desperation. A garbled voice, thick with static. Prototype. Integrity compromised. Budget cuts. Another fragment of text. Another fragment of text. Ignore Sector Gamma 7 warnings. Profitability, priority, and then, chillingly, a series of coordinates of Kale's accident. These weren't official communications, not in the corporate sense. They felt like secrets, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, trying to find a way out of the suffocating grip of Athel Inc. They were broken, disjointed, like pieces of a vast shattered mirror. But even in their fragmentation, they spoke volumes. They hinted at a network, a hidden undercurrent of dissent and warning, a fragile web of truth trying to pierce through the corporate lies. I held the datapad close, its dim screen illuminating my face in the quiet darkness of my bunk. The whispers from the cosmic cradle had always been there, not just of creation, but of corruption. And now I had found their faint, defiant echo. The sorrow for Kale was still a heavy shroud, but beneath it, a quiet, fierce resolve had ignited. I would listen to the whispers, I would find the mirror, and I would piece it back together, one broken fragment at a time. For Kale, and for all the others whose whispers had been silenced by the relentless clang of Athel's chains. Sometimes, when the station's recycled air hummed too loudly, or the vast, star-pricked canvas outside the viewport felt too heavy with secrets, Ilara would close her eyes, not to sleep, but to sift through the static in her mind, searching for a single, clear frequency. It was a habit born of necessity, of chasing ghosts in the machine. Her fingers, nimble and accustomed to the cold bite of old circuitry, danced across a repurposed terminal, its screen a dim, flickering pool in the muted light of her small, hidden alcove. Dust motes perpetually adrift in the low gravity caught the faint glow, spiraling like tiny, lost constellations. The clues had been gossamer thin, almost imperceptible, a misplaced decimal in an ancient public ledger, a broken link in a corporate archive that led not to a dead end, but to a corrupted fragment of code. Each piece was a single, chipped ceramic shard, hinting at a larger, shattered mosaic. She'd spent weeks, then months, following these faint breadcrumbs, a silent hunt conducted in the lonely hours when others slept, or pretended to. It felt less like investigation, and more like a whispered conversation with forgotten echoes, trying to discern meaning from the crackle of forgotten channels. She remembered the chill that had snaked down her spine when the first breakthrough came. Not a triumphant burst of data, but a slow, hesitant hand reaching back through the digital wilderness. It was a nearly obsolete encryption key, hidden within the metadata of a long decommissioned asteroid prospector's log. A flicker of recognition, a forgotten protocol. She fed it into the terminal, the old machine groaning faintly in protest, as if unwilling to dredge up the past. Then, a network began to unfurl before her, not a blazing highway of information, but a series of narrow, winding tunnels. These were the forgotten communication channels, patched together from derelict satellites, ghost nodes and abandoned mining outposts, and even repurposed combuoys from a time before Athel Inc. had solidified its dominion over the orbital pathway. It was a digital darknet, woven from threads of desperation and defiance, humming with a quiet, persistent life of its own. Within these channels, she found the data caches, not grand, centralized servers, but scattered, fragmented repositories. A scientist's personal drive, carefully wiped, but not completely, buried within a defunct research station. A former logistics coordinator's daily logs, encrypted with a childlike cipher and left on a public-facing port, hoping someone, someday, might find it. The raw telemetry from a deep space probe, revealing anomalies that Athel's official reports conveniently omitted. Each cache was like opening a dusty old diary. They spoke in hushed tones, in the dry language of scientific reports and the raw, unedited confessions of the disillusioned. She saw names, faces even, blurred and pixelated, but undeniably human. Scientists, their early excitement at the prospect of unlocking the universe's secrets slowly curdling into horror as they watched their ethical guidelines systematically dismantled. Engineers who had designed the magnificent mining rigs, now haunted by the knowledge of the human cost hidden beneath layers of projected glory. Former corporate employees, their voices trembling with residual fear, recounting the forced overtime, the impossible quotas, the fabricated safety reports that led to untold accidents in the void. One particular cache held a series of encrypted audio files. She listened, her breath held to the crackle of a distant, frantic voice. A geologist reporting catastrophic structural integrity issues on a newly exploited asteroid. His pleas for a safety halt, for a review of the stress models, were met with corporate indifference, then outright threats. The last recording was a choked gasp, followed by the sound of rending metal, then silence. Athel's official statement had cited a meteoroid impact, an unforeseeable tragedy, but the data Alara held hummed with a different truth. Another file contained a collection of internal memos, revealing the deliberate suppression of data regarding the long-term health effects of prolonged exposure to certain unshielded radiation fields, a known risk for miners on the outer fringes. The memos, casually weighed the cost of proper shielding against the cost of personnel turnover and PR management. The numbers were cold, sterile, but the implications were a brutal slap, confirming the deep, systemic abuses woven into the very fabric of the space dream. It wasn't just physical exploitation. There were testimonials of intellectual property theft, of independent researchers strong-armed and silenced, their discoveries co-opted and rebranded under Athel's ubiquitous logo. The dream of open exploration, of shared scientific advancement, had been systematically suffocated, replaced by a ruthless, monolithic pursuit of profit. Ilara felt a profound, aching sadness blossom in her chest. It was the same quiet melancholy that settled over the ancient Earth archives, whispering of what had been lost. Here, in the sterile silence of space, the same human flaws had merely found new ground to root, new stars to poison with their ambition. The shimmering promise of stardust, the whispered hope of a new beginning, had been nothing but a lure, a gilded cage designed to ensnare. But as the network grew, as more data caches unlocked and more hidden channels hummed to life, a new feeling began to stir within her. It was a quiet hum, not of despair but of connection. She wasn't alone. These fragments of truth, scattered across the void, coalesced into a silent testament, a collective memory of betrayal. Disillusioned scientists, former corporate employees. They were a scattered congregation of the wronged, their voices, though fragmented and distant, now reaching out through the digital dust. She felt them, a network of weary souls linked by shared witness. A clandestine group holding on to the shards of a shattered dream. They were ghosts in the machine, but ghosts with a story to tell, a truth to reclaim. Ilara had followed the whispers into the dark, and now, in the quiet hum of her terminal, she heard them whispering back. Not of fear, not entirely, but of a quiet, burning resolve. The answer to who owned the stars remained the same. Yes, but perhaps, just perhaps, these hidden voices could still change the question. Sometimes I close my eyes and I can still see it. The raw, untamed gleam of creation itself. A whisper from the cosmic cradle. They called it stardust, a romantic name for the cold, hard promise that drifted in the inky black. We left Earth, a planet hollowed out and gasping, chasing that promise. We told ourselves we were pioneers, forging a new destiny, bringing salvation back home. But the void doesn't care for dreams. It doesn't care for ownership, only for power. And soon, the whispers of liberation turned into the harsh, metallic clang of chains, forged not from stardust, but from the very human greed that followed us beyond the sky. Who owned the stars? We soon learned, to our sorrow, that the answer was always the same. Not us. The console hummed a low, almost mournful tune, its faint light bathing Ilara's face in a pale electric glow. She sat hunched, a ghost, in the vast, silent heart of the station, her fingers hovering over the interface. The ghost codes, that fractured, whispering stream of data, had been a myth for so long, a persistent rumor among the grayer, more disillusioned miners. Now they were real, pulsing beneath her touch, a hidden pulse within Athel Inc.'s monolithic arteries. It began subtly, like a forgotten melody resurfacing from a deep slumber. A discrepancy here, a misalignment there. At first, she dismissed them as errors, glitches in an aging system. But as she delved deeper, Following the serpentine trails of encrypted logs and bypassed protocols, the whispers grew clearer, coalescing into a chilling harmony. The ghost codes weren't glitches, they were echoes of truth, deliberately buried, screaming through the static. She saw the raw data first, a torrent of numbers that painted a picture far more abundant than any official report had ever dared to suggest. The yield projections, the actual haul manifests from 100 distant asteroid fields. They were astronomical. Not just a slight overestimation by Athel's field teams, but a monumental, systematic fabrication. Her fingers flew, tracing connections, cross-referencing public statements against these hidden truths. The official reports beamed back to a desperate Earth, consistently showed a fraction of what was truly being extracted. It was like looking at a single drop of water and being told it was the ocean. Her heart began to ache with a dull, insistent throb. The sheer scale of the deception unfolded before her like a nightmare in slow motion. She saw it in the hidden warehouses, vast, automated caverns carved into dead asteroids, brimming with shimmering ingots of rare earth metals, critical alloys, and precious elements. Mountains of wealth, enough to rebuild entire cities on Earth, lay dormant, gathering cosmic dust. These weren't temporary surpluses. These were permanent, strategic stockpiles, invisible to the desperate eyes below. They were hoarding the very salvation they had promised. The economic data was even more damning. She saw the price curves for essential metals on Earth, spiraling ever upwards, spiking with each carefully orchestrated shortage announcement from Athel Inc. On the screens before her, she could overlay the true supply data against the fabricated scarcity narratives. The correlation was absolute, brutal in its clarity. While Earth withered, its industries starved for resources, its people struggling to afford even the most basic components for survival, Athel's deep space vaults remained full, their reserves untouched, a silent testament to their monstrous avarice. It wasn't merely profiteering. It was an intricate, meticulously planned stratagem. They weren't just exploiting a market. They were creating it, bending reality to their will. The ghost codes revealed shell corporations, labyrinthine financial transfers, and a network of complicit data nodes that ensured no true auditor could ever piece together the full picture. The scarcity on Earth wasn't an unfortunate side effect of deep space logistics. It was the deliberate design, a fabricated crisis, maintained with cold, calculating precision. Ilara leaned back, the station's distant thrum now feeling like a drumbeat against her own raw nerves. The dreamlike quality of her discovery dissolved into a sharp, painful clarity. Athel Inc.'s goal, laid bare in the ghostly streams of data, was terrifyingly simple yet horrifyingly profound. By controlling the supply of orbital wealth, by manufacturing scarcity on a global scale, they had forged an unbreakable chain around terrestrial economies. Earth, once the master of its own fate, was now a pawn in a cosmic game of power, perpetually dependent, perpetually indebted. The whispers in the codes, once a source of frantic curiosity, now echoed with a profound sorrow. The grand promise of space, the boundless frontier that was meant to free humanity, had instead become its ultimate cage. The metallic clang of chains, those I had felt only in abstraction, now vibrated through Ilara's very bones. It wasn't just Athel Inc. who owned the metals. They own the hope, the future, the very breath of a dying world. And in that moment, seeing the full ugly truth, Ilara knew with a chilling certainty that the answer to who owned the stars was still the same and would forever be, not us. The weight of that knowledge settled upon her, heavy and cold, a new, unbearable burden in the endless, indifferent void. The stale air in the maintenance duct always tasted of ozone and recycled fear. It clung to the back of my throat, a familiar bitterness that had become the scent of our lives. We huddled there, 5 shadows swallowed by deeper shadows, the hum of Athel Inc.'s life support systems, a constant, oppressive lullaby around us. Sometimes, when the hum softened just enough, I could almost hear the whisper of the stars we'd come here to tame, a forgotten promise echoing in the void. My eyes found them, one by one, illuminated by the faint glow of a hacked compad. Lyra, her face a map of quiet determination, scars tracing stories I knew too well. Jax, constantly vigilant, his fingers twitching as if still grappling with a fractured data stick. Kale, young and restless, but with a gaze that held the weight of too many stolen years. And old Finn, whose wisdom was etched into every wrinkle, a man who remembered the Earth before it became a legend. They were my anchors, my fragile constellation in this endless night. We weren't meant for this, none of us. We were the children of the promise, the ones who believed in a new Genesis, a chance to rebuild from the ashes of a dying world. But the void, it doesn't cleanse. It merely amplifies. And here, in the cold heart of Athel's dominion, the greed that hollowed Earth had found new, richer veins to tap. We were merely tools, expendable. Our dreams crushed into the same fine dust as the asteroids we carved apart. Our very breath, filtered and recycled, was technically Athel's property. Our lives, a ledger entry. The latest reports from the Gamma Quadrant. Lyra's voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the ventilation. She projected a feed onto the grimy wall, a blurry image of a facility, half-built, half-devoured by the asteroid it clung to. They're pushing extraction cycles beyond safe parameters. Another depressurization incident last cycle. 4 souls lost, marked as operational casualties. 4 souls. Athel's internal logs would list them as equipment failures, maybe a simple deletion. But they were mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, dreams extinguished, hope eroded. The numbers had stopped meaning anything to Athel long ago, if they ever did. But to us, each number was a fresh internal bleed. My gaze drifted, not to the image, but past it, through the metal plating, to the imagined expanse of space beyond. I remembered a story Finn had told me once, from the old Earth, about salmon fighting their way upstream against impossible currents just to spawn. A primal urge, a desperation to leave something behind, a truth. That's what this felt like. Not a rebellion, not an uprising. Just a single desperate upstream swim. We can't fight them in the open. Kale whispered, echoing the thought that had haunted us all. He looked at Finn, at me, searching for a different answer. There wasn't one. Athel's security forces were omnipresent, their AI networks woven into the very fabric of the station. A violent act would be suicide, a futile spark swallowed by the dark. We knew that. Our objective was never to break their hold with force, but to shatter their carefully constructed illusion. No, I affirmed, my voice softer than I intended, yet firm. We show Earth what they're doing. The truth, unvarnished. Let them decide if this is the salvation they paid for. The plan had been a slow, agonizing birth, forged in stolen moments and hushed conversations. It wasn't grand or heroic. It was meticulously, painstakingly small, a surgical strike, as Finn had called it, against the network's central nervous system, where Athel archived its crimes. We wouldn't destroy anything. We would merely copy. Jax, his eyes bright with a coder's intensity, pointed to a schematic on the compad. The main data conduit. It runs through Sector 7 Delta, past the old comms array. It's decommissioned, but the physical lines are still there, barely monitored. Sector 7 Delta. A labyrinth of forgotten pathways, rusted pipes, and dead-end shafts. The perfect blind spot. The comms array, a relic from the early colonization days, before Athel consolidated its monopoly. It was a fragile, unstable thing. But if we could reroute enough power, enough signal, it might just reach the data itself. Lyra interjected, her gaze sweeping over our faces. Sweeping over our faces. The operational logs, the accident reports, the suppressed health records, the financial discrepancies, it's all stored on the core server in Main Command, Level 3. Main Command, a fortress, impenetrable. Athel's crown jewel, protected by layers of biometric scanners, laser grids, and silent, patrolling automatons. The idea felt like a fragile wisp of smoke against a hurricane. They have a vulnerability, I said, remembering the months I'd spent in Main Command myself, cleaning data conduits, a ghost in the machine. An old service port. It's meant for emergency diagnostics. A manual override, buried deep in the system architecture, forgotten by the automated sweeps. My breath hitched. I could still see it in my mind's eye. A faded yellow label. Service port M13, tucked behind a dusty panel near a rarely used filtration unit. It was a relic. A design flaw from a simpler time. A forgotten key? The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken fears. This wasn't about heroics. It was about survival, about dignity, about the faint hope that somewhere on that distant blue sphere there were still people who cared about truth more than profit. Getting access to Main Command, it will be the hardest part. Finn finally spoke, his voice raspy, and rerouting the power to that old array. A surge will be noticed. We'll need a distraction, Jax offered, his fingers already flying across the compad, sketching out possibilities. A controlled overload in the power grid, maybe, far enough away to seem unrelated, close enough to draw their attention. We talked for hours, our voices low, almost liturgical. Each contingency, each risk, weighed and reweighed. The timing, the entry points, the data packets, the burst transmission sequence. It was a dance with oblivion, a delicate ballet between truth and consequence. We weren't naive. We knew the odds. Athel would retaliate, swiftly and brutally, if we failed. But the alternative was a slow, silent death under their heel, the complete erasure of our existence. As the meeting dispersed, melting back into the shadows they'd emerged from, a profound weariness settled over me. It wasn't the physical exhaustion of mining, but the soul-deep ache of carrying such a heavy burden. I watched Lyra disappear down a darkened corridor, Jack silently rebooting his compad, Kale's youthful face etched with a newfound gravity, Finn's slow, deliberate steps. They were all I had left, our collective desperation, a fragile shield against an empire built on lies. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I was back on Earth, a child gazing up at the impossibly bright stars, dreaming of a future unburdened. The void had stolen that dream, twisted it into something unrecognizable. But perhaps, just perhaps, if we sent enough truth hurtling through the dark, a tiny spark might still ignite, a whisper of what was lost, a desperate plea that might just find its way home. We were not seeking revolution. We were simply trying to reclaim a small piece of ourselves, to prove that even in this desolate expanse, some things, like truth, could not be owned. Not entirely. I remember the hum of the comms array that night, a low thrumming heartbeat in the silent, suffocating metal belly of the station. It wasn't the usual rhythmic drone of war processors or the sigh of life support. This was different, charged with a desperate, fragile hope. We stood shoulder to shoulder, our faces illuminated by the pale glow of the console screens. A mosaic of grim resolve and an almost unbearable fear. This was it, the culmination of whispered meetings, stolen data chips, and the agonizing weight of complicity. The plan, as we so blithely called it, was more of a prayer, a throwing of our souls into the cosmic wind. We were reaching for Earth, a distant blue marble we barely remembered, across the yawning chasm of interstellar space, with nothing but a torrent of truth. The data package, compressed and encrypted, was a testament to the decades of quiet suffering, the raw statistics of human bodies broken for corporate profit, the ecological scars left on the planet we'd vowed to save. It was the proof of the lie, the cold, hard evidence that the stardust we chased had been forged into shackles, not salvation. When the signal light blinked green, a tiny defiant beacon against the black, a collective breath hitched in our throats. There was no cheer, no triumphant shout, just a profound, aching silence. We watched the upload bar creep across the screen, a digital heartbeat counting down not to victory, but to inevitable reckoning. It felt like watching a tiny seed sprout in a hurricane, knowing its fate, yet marveling at its courage. The data, raw and untamed, was now loose, rushing through the ether, past the orbital sentinels, past the corporate firewalls, a whisper of rebellion echoing across the void, aimed directly at the slumbering consciousness of the populace below. We had sacrificed our safety, our anonymity, our very lives, for this fleeting, desperate moment of truth. We knew it even then, with a bone-deep certainty that chilled us more than the vacuum outside. The quiet, almost sacred, moment shattered with the violence of a collapsing bulkhead. Alarms shrieked, not the familiar maintenance alerts, but a high-pitched, insistent wail that reverberated through the very bones of the station, turning its comforting thrum into a predatory growl. Red lights flashed, painting everything in a lurid, infernal glow. The screens around us flickered, then died, plunging us into sudden, terrifying near darkness, illuminated only by the frantic strobing of the emergency systems. Wah. They know. Someone breathed, a voice barely audible above the rising cacophony. Of course they knew. How could they not? The corporate giants had eyes and ears everywhere, their digital tendrils woven into every circuit, every breath of the station. This entire metallic shell was their panopticon, and we had dared to scratch its surface. Move! A sharp voice cut through the paralysis. Access tunnel beta. Now. The command jolted us into motion. We scrambled, a tangled knot of bodies, through the emergency hatch and into the narrow, unlit service conduit. The air, usually circulating with a sterile efficiency, felt thick and stale, laden with the metallic tang of fear. Footsteps pounded behind us, growing louder, closer. The cold dread that had been a distant hum now pulsed through our veins, a desperate rhythm of fight or flight. The corporate security forces were fast, efficient, and utterly merciless. We heard their shouts, distorted by the narrow confines, their heavy boots clanking on the metal grating of the main corridors. They were like hounds unleashed, their hunger for retribution palpable. We plunged deeper into the station's forgotten arteries, a labyrinth of pipes, cables, and structural supports, a place where only drones and maintenance bots usually ventured. Every turn was a gamble, every shadow a potential ambush. The air grew heavier, the silence between our ragged breaths more terrifying. We moved like phantoms, our movements jerky, fueled by pure adrenaline, our hearts hammering against our ribs. The narrowness of the tunnels pressed in on us, a physical manifestation of the closing trap. I could feel the cold metal against my fingertips as I scraped along a conduit, the smell of ozone and stale air filling my lungs. A grating screech echoed from ahead. A heavy pressure door slamming shut. We skidded to a halt, our meager momentum arrested. Locked, they're sealing off sectors. Panic clawed at my throat. We were trapped. The relentless, rhythmic clang of the security team's approach echoed from both directions now, closing in. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the dizzying, nauseating realization that this wasn't just a chase. It was an execution. We had traded the slow, quiet death of exploitation for a swift, brutal end, caught in the cold, unfeeling jaws of the very power we sought to expose. The stardust, the dreams, the whisper of salvation, they all felt so terribly, terribly replaced by the harsh metallic clang of impending doom. The station, our sanctuary, had become our tomb. The silence, when it finally settled, was not the peace we had imagined. It was a heavier thing, thick with the dust of fallen empires and the echoes of shouts long faded. Aethel, Inc. was a broken glass ship, its grand, arrogant hull cracked and splintered across 100 orbital lanes, its core operations finally silenced, its tendrils of control severed. We had done it. We, the disparate, the desperate, the dreamers and the broken, had brought down the Titan. Yet, looking out at the faint, distant shimmer of the asteroid fields, now finally truly free of Athel's direct iron grasp, all I felt was a profound, aching weariness. I traced the lines on my hand, the roadmap of a life lived too fast, too hard. My fingers, once quick and agile on a mining rig's console, now trembled slightly. The mirrored surface of the window, aged with micro-impacts, reflected a face I barely recognized. Alara, much older, her eyes holding the deep, knowing sorrow of one who has seen too much of the void, both in space and in the human heart. The silver strands that wove through my hair were not just from time, but from the relentless press of every decision, every loss, every moment where the line between hope and desperation blurred. We spoke of victory in hushed tones, almost apologetically. The cost had been immense. The numbers tallied in shattered lives, in the ghost ships that drifted aimlessly, in the vacant eyes of those who returned to the fragile habitats. Friends, comrades, faces I could still conjure in the quiet dark of my sleeping quarters. Their laughter, their fears, their unshakable belief in a future that, even now felt just out of reach. Their names were etched not into monuments, but into the deep, unyielding rock of my memory, each one a whisper of what was given for this hollowed-out piece. Was it a liberation, I wondered, running a callous thumb over the cool glass? Ethel was gone, yes. Its specific brand of corporate tyranny had been dismantled, but the structures remained, the hunger for the precious metals undiminished, the systems of extraction still grinding. There were new players now, smaller corporations, consortiums, even independent mining groups, born from the rebellion's ashes. Yet the old questions lingered, like the faint, metallic tang of an asteroid's heartwood, refusing to dissipate. Who owned the metals in space? We had fought for the right to say, not Ethel. But in saying so, had we truly claimed them for ourselves, for everyone, or merely cleared the stage for another act of the same? Tired play. The grand dream, the one that had beckoned us away from a dying Earth. A dream of self-sufficiency, of a new golden age fueled by cosmic abundance, felt like a fragile, half-remembered melody now. It had been twisted, distorted, used as a banner for exploitation. We had chased salvation, only to find the same demons of greed had followed us, their shadows stretching long across the silent, star-dusted plains of distant rocks. We had poured our souls into the void, hoping to draw out a better future. But the future we found was stained with the very human flaws we thought we'd left behind. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, I would close my eyes and try to recall the pristine clarity of our initial departure. The Earth shrinking behind us, a blue marble of promises and pains. The vast, indifferent canvas of space before us, painted with the promise of untold riches. We were so young then, so full of an eager, almost foolish optimism. We believed in the purity of the quest, in the inherent rightness of our pioneering spirit. We learned, with bitter clarity, that ownership was a concept forged in the dense gravity of planets, a terrestrial disease that metastasized even in the weightlessness of orbit. I watched a maintenance bot trundle past my window, its red eye blinking a silent acknowledgement of my presence. Life continued, adapted, found new rhythms. The asteroids were still mined, the resources still flowed, albeit now with less centralized control, less egregious cruelty. A fragile, imperfect truce had settled over the fields. Perhaps this was the best we could hope for. Perhaps absolute freedom, absolute ownership by all, was as much a phantom as the ghost of the Earth we'd left behind. A sigh escaped me, a thin wisp of air in the recycled atmosphere. The setting sun of our distant star cast long orange shadows across the habitat's interior, bathing it in a warm, melancholic glow. It was beautiful, in its own way, a bittersweet beauty built on the bones of sacrifice, adorned with the quiet, enduring weight of what was lost. We had won, yes. We had broken the chain, but the question remained, echoing in the vast, silent reaches of space and deep within my weary heart. Who truly owned the metals? The stardust, the promise itself, the void, impassive and eternal, offered no answers. And I, Elira, the survivor, the fighter, the witness, could only look out at the silent stars and wonder if we had truly changed anything at all, or merely traded one set of masters for the quiet, enduring sorrow of knowing that some questions, like the cosmos itself, are simply too vast to ever be truly answered.